Hi again. In this video, we'll continue reading Peak, starting with chapter 27, and we will actually finish the book in this video. So that's super exciting. Just a quick reminder of the events that happened the last time we read. Josh had convinced, or he tricked the climbers and Captain Sheck into thinking that Peak was no longer going to try for the summit and was leaving the mountain. So Peak went down the mountain in a pickup truck with Zopa. But they actually met Sunjo at the bottom of the mountain, and now the three of them and Yogi and Yash, the two other Sherpas that were with them, are going to be climbing all the way up to the summit secretly, taking another non-conventional route up the mountain. So it'll be a little bit more difficult for them, but at least they're still getting to try for the summit. So when we left off, they were leaving, or just about to leave, their makeshift Camp 3 that they had set up that was parallel to the actually established Camp 3 on the mountain that everyone normally stays at. They were going to make their way up to Camp 4, but a wrench was kind of thrown into their plans because Zopa is now sick, and he won't be able to climb higher than Camp 4. So he'll go up with them to Camp 4 and then make his way back down the mountain so that he can recover. So Yogi and Yash will be responsible after that point for Sunjo and Peak getting to the summit safely. So let's begin. Chapter 27, Camps 5 and 6. Because of our late start, I thought Camp 4 was close, but we didn't get to the dreaded wall leading up to it until well after dark. We're climbing the wall at night? I asked, shocked. Zopa took off his mask. It's the only way to get into Camp 4 unnoticed. Everyone will be asleep. They would be in their tents all right. The wind was howling and it hadn't stopped snowing all day. But from our last experience, I knew they wouldn't be sleeping. If they were like me when I was up there, they would be lying in their sleeping bags wondering if there was enough air to keep them alive through the night. The last time we were here, it took me over 5 hours to reach the top, and I nearly gave up on the way. The weather was worse now, and it was dark. Yogi and Yash had thrown a rope over the side for us to use. You'll need headlamps, Zopa said. Right, I said. Slide the Jamar up the rope, step, breathe, Jamar, step, Jamar, think, look up, think again, step, rest, 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 hug the wall, pray. The same routine, but in a strange way, the climb was easier, or at least less scary, with the headlamp. The light kept me focused on the ice and rock in front of me. I had no idea where the top or bottom was until a light appeared over the edge about 10 feet above me. It was Yogi, although it was hard to tell, bundled up like he was. I managed to get to the top without his having to grab me. As I rested on my knees trying to catch my breath and not puke, I looked at my watch. I had climbed the wall in less than 5 hours this time. 15 minutes later, Sunjo came over the top looking like he was about to pass out. I shouted in his ear that he had made it up the wall a half hour faster than he had the last time. This seemed to cheer him up. He managed to get onto his feet. Zopa was last. He was in terrible shape. It took all three of us to pull him over the edge, and when we got him there, he didn't move. I checked his oxygen tank. It was empty. Yogi hurried off and came back with a fresh tank and Yash. They got the O's flowing and carried Zopa to their tent. After an hour or so, he recovered enough to open his eyes and drink something. A few minutes later, he asked the brothers if they had heard anything from Josh. The Chinese soldier climbers had reached ABC that afternoon and were planning on staying there a day or two before climbing up to Camp 4. They had checked everyone's papers and searched all the tents. The climbers at ABC said the soldiers were in great shape and had made terrific time. There was no doubt they were going to try for the summit. This seemed like the worst possible news, but Zopa didn't seem at all disturbed by it. You will be a day ahead of them. Tonight and tomorrow you will rest. The following morning, before light, you will climb to Camp 5. What about you? Sunjo asked. Do you really think they are going to be worried about a sick old monk when they get up here? If they are really such good climbers, the soldiers will all want to try for the summit. Which of them will stay behind to escort the old man down the mountain? He gave a wheezy laugh. By the time they get back here, I'll be gone. Why can't we just go up to Camp 5 when it gets light? I asked. We'll be just that much farther ahead of the soldiers. There will be a storm in a few hours, Zopa answered. Tomorrow morning is your window. The storm hit us mid-morning. If we had left when I wanted, we would have been about halfway to Camp 5, and we would have died, along with the three climbers who did leave that morning. None of them made it to Camp 5, and nobody could help them. The weather was too severe. I tried to write in my moleskin and found that I couldn't concentrate long enough to string more than 2 or 3 words together at a time. After a while, I gave up and managed to get a little sleep, and so did Sunjo, mostly because there was nothing else to do but lie in the tent. Zopa didn't want us wandering around camp, not that we had the energy, and the storm was so bad, everyone there was hunkered down waiting for it to stop. About 8 o'clock that night, it did, suddenly. One moment, the wind and snow were threatening to blow our tent away. The next moment, it was perfectly calm. I stuck my head outside the tent along with everyone else in camp and saw a perfectly clear sky overhead scattered with bright stars. Yash left for Camp 5 3 hours ahead of us to get the camp ready. Yogi stuck his head into our tent an hour before we were to leave and told us to pack our gear. We weren't taking much with us. Most of what we needed would be waiting for us at Camp 5. Yogi and Yash had hauled it up the last time we were at Camp 4. Before we took off, we checked in with Zopa. He was sitting up drinking a mug of tea. He was off the O's, and some of the color had returned to his face, but he still looked pretty weak. Speed is everything now. If you stay in the death zone too long, you'll die. If you don't reach the summit by 1:35 p.m. the day you leave Camp 6, I have asked Yogi and Yash to turn you around. It is better to be caught by the Chinese than it is to die on the mountain. This seemed to contradict his plan to get Sunjo over the top to safety, but he was right. From Camp 6, you will have to reach the summit and return in about 18 hours. Oxygen or not, there was a limit to how long you could survive above Camp 6. If we made the summit, we would have to reach the top camp on the other side in 18 hours. Have Yogi and Yash been to the summit? I asked. It had been a question on my mind since Zopa had announced that he wasn't taking us up there himself. Of course, Zopa said. 3 times. Good, I said. Does Josh know you're not coming with us? Zopa shook his head, then gave us a blessing and said, I'll see you both in Kathmandu. Now go. It was clear and bitterly cold as we left the dark camp and started up the North Ridge to the summit. It was hard to keep my excitement in check. A night at Camp 5, a night at Camp 6, then the top of the world. It was more of a forced march to Camp 5 than a climb. We hooked onto a series of fixed ropes. Yogi set the pace. I tried a regime of 12 steps, a minute of gasping to recover, then another 12 steps. After an hour, it was down to about 8 steps, and I'm not sure how many minutes to recover. It was hard to believe that some climbers had made it to the summit without any supplemental O's at all. Josh was one of them, although I suspected on this trip he would be sucking down the O's, if for no other reason than to stay sharp so he didn't lose one of his clients. The sun came up and gave us the best view of Everest's pyramidal summit yet. It was enormous. Coming off the top was a disk of ice crystals against the blue sky. The sight inspired my sluggish brain to remember the camera, which I had put in my pocket before we left Camp 4. I shouted ahead at Sunjo to wait up, which he was more than happy to do. When I got to him, I took off my outer mittens, pushed the record button, and tried to imitate JR as best as I could. What are you feeling right now? I asked. You're less than a mile from the highest point on Earth. I had him framed perfectly against the summit. Frightened, Sunjo said, and hopeful, and worried about my grandfather. I had no idea it would be this hard. That was about all my unmittened fingers could take. I can film now if you like, Sunjo offered. Nah, that's all right. We have to get moving. About a half hour later, we saw our first corpse. Sunjo saw it first. I walked up to him as he was staring down at it. Yogi had breezed by as if he hadn't noticed, but I bet he had. It was a woman. About 50 feet away was another corpse, but I couldn't tell what it was because it was laying face down. I had never seen a dead person, let alone a frozen dead person. She looked more like a wax figure than a former human being, and in a way this was even more disturbing to me. She had been there a while if her shredded clothes were any indication. It looked like she had died sitting up and had fallen over on her side. She was only a few hours from her tent at Camp 4. I'm not sure how long we stood there staring, and we would have stood there a lot longer if Yogi hadn't shouted at us to hurry up. After 5 more corpses, I stopped looking. At noon, we came to a steeper part of the North Ridge. It was much colder. The fixed ropes were frozen, and Sherpas had chipped shallow steps into the ice to make it easier to climb. Yogi waited for us to catch up to him. He pointed to the tents down at Camp 4, then up to tents at Camp 5, and said something in Nepalese. Halfway, Sunjo translated. 6 hours to go. To make that 6 hours worse, the wind picked up. We had to bend over as we climbed so we weren't blown off the ridge. My initial excitement was also long gone. I think the only thing that kept me going were the O's waiting for me up ahead. I don't know what kept Sunjo going. Probably the Chinese climbers behind him and freedom ahead. We got to Camp 5 a little before 7. 25,196 feet. It seemed impossible that we could ever go any farther. It was the end of the world, and it really wasn't a camp. It was a series of cleared platforms stretching up the north ridge for at least a quarter of a mile, with absolutely no shelter from the howling wind. The big platforms could hold 5 or 6 tents, the small platforms 1 or 2. Several of the platforms had tents on them, but it was hard to say how many people were up there. I suspected most of the tents were waiting for climbers coming up from Camp 4, or down from Camp 6 after their summit attempt. Our tiny rubble pile was just big enough for 2 tents pitched on the garbage of the former occupants. Yash had water boiling for tea, but what I was interested in was the mask strapped to his face pumping O's into his lungs. He was moving twice as fast as we were. I grabbed a tank from the pile, pulled the mask out of my pack, hooked it up, and stuck my face in it. The feeling I had with the first lungful of oxygen is indescribable. Bliss is about as close as I can come, but it was way beyond that. Yash helped Sunjo set up his rig, and when he got on, we looked at each other and started laughing. We were going to live. We might even make it to the summit. The Chinese are heading up to Camp 4 tomorrow, one of the climbers from ABC told Josh. You're kidding, Josh said. What about acclimatization? These guys are acclimated. One of our climbers speaks a little Chinese. They told her they were up on K2 when they were ordered to come here. They haven't said it, but I don't think they're coming back down until they take a shot at the summit. They're like climbing machines. When are you heading up? The day after tomorrow, if the weather's good, Josh answered. I was going to hold off a little longer, but I took my people out for a climb today, and they all did pretty well. The virus seems to have run its course. We're heading up to Camp 4 in the morning. We'll see you on the way back down. Good luck, Josh said. Out. This was probably the last transmission we would hear. I wonder if Josh would be worried when he didn't pass me on his way up. I asked Sunjo how he was doing. The oxygen helps, but I'm still concerned, he said. I had a lot of trouble today. You're not the only one. It's hard up here. I have to make it, he said, for my sisters and my mother. Those were great reasons to risk your life, I thought. But why was I doing it? For Josh's business? For my ego? Now that my brain had oxygen, I found myself really missing the 2 Ps, my mom, and even Rolf. This got me to thinking about the corpses we saw on the way up here. Who had they left behind? These are very uncomfortable questions to fall asleep on. The oxygen was wonderful, but the masks were a pain in the butt to sleep in. It was hard to find a position where the straps didn't dig into your face. Also, the exhaust system stank. Small pools of icy slime collected in the mouthpiece valve. When I moved my head, slushy spit ran down my neck. Because of this, Sunjo and I were up early. We checked and rechecked our gear. Leaving something behind like a spare headlamp battery or a glove could be a death sentence. Yogi took the lead this time, leaving Yash to take us up to Camp 6. Our first obstacle was a steep snowfield that we had to 4-point with ice axes and crampons. Stupidly, I assumed that now that we were on O's, it would be like climbing at sea level. Nothing could be further from the truth. By the time we reached the top of the snowfield, my lungs were screaming for air. I thought there was something the matter with my mask or the tank had run out of oxygen, but everything was working perfectly. The 2 liters of oxygen didn't simulate sea level. It simply allowed me to stay alive above 25,000 feet. And there was a huge difference between lying in a tent doing virtually nothing and climbing a steep snowfield on all 4s. I took the little camera out and filmed Sunjo crabbing his way up to me. By the expression on his face, I could see he was having the same revelation I just had. I don't think I can make it, he gasped. I'm serious, Peak. This is too much. We just pushed it too hard going up the field, I said, with a confidence I didn't feel. We'll just have to pace ourselves. He nodded, but there was fear in his eyes. I knew exactly how he felt. We had passed another 3 or 4 corpses on the way up. A few hours later, I stopped to rest and looked at my altimeter watch. We had just passed 26,000 feet, and were officially in the death zone. Every minute from now on, we were dying a little. We stumbled into Camp 6 like 3 zombies. Yogi had the tent set up, but he didn't look much better than we did. He told Sunjo to get our stove going to boil snow and drink as much water as we could. The very idea of drinking or eating anything made my stomach lurch. I turned on the video camera and shot Sunjo lighting the stove, or trying to light the stove. It must have taken him 50 strokes to get the cigarette lighter going in the thin air. When it finally ignited, his thumb was bleeding like he had sliced it open with a knife. We gagged down as much food and water as we could, then wrapped up in our sleeping bags to wait. Sleep was out of the question. The inside of the tent was filled with a thin layer of frost from our breath. Every time one of us moved, the freezing crystals fell on our faces. They say that when you die, your life flashes before your eyes. Mine was passing before my eyes in slow motion, like a horror movie. I think it was the corpses that did it. I thought of Mom falling off that wall, the boy I'd never met falling off the Flatiron building, Sunjo hanging by a thread on that ice wall, and Sunjo's father saving my father, then dying of heart failure. The only thing that stopped the depressing playback was the tent flap opening and the appearance of Yogi's masked face. "We go," he said. Well, not quite. It was more like, "We get ready to go." They made us drink more water, then told us to do our toilet, which is a lot easier said than done at 30 degrees below zero. 2 hours later, we were ready. We left for the summit of Mount Everest. I looked at my watch. It was 1:35 a.m. We had 12 hours to get there. Chapter 28, Top of the World. Outside Camp 6, we picked our way across 2 snowfields. Yash led the way with Yogi sticking close to us. On the far side of the second field, we started to encounter bare rock. I kept my eyes on Yash's headlamp. He was probably 150 yards ahead of us. Breathing was difficult and it was freezing out, but I started to think this might not be as bad as I thought. It was certainly no worse than what we had already been through. Then, to my utter shock, Yash's headlamp started to rise from the ground. I blinked several times, thinking it was some kind of optical illusion. It wasn't. He was climbing a steep wall. "Yellow band!" Yogi shouted above the howling wind. "Careful!" We started up. Large chunks of yellowish sandstone broke off with almost every handhold, and the crampons strapped on our boots were worse than useless. They're made for ice, not rock, but there wasn't time to take them off. At base camp, it would take 3 minutes to shuck the crampons. Up here in the thin air, it might take half an hour or longer. We didn't have half an hour to spare, and we would have to put them back on the next time we came across ice or snow, which takes longer than taking them off. There were ropes, but most of them were rotten, flapping uselessly in the wind. About an hour into the climb, I grabbed one to help me over a difficult pitch, and it popped loose from its anchor. I barely caught myself before I keeled over backward. I didn't touch another rope on the way up. There were 3 steps leading to the summit, and this had to be the first. But if that was the case, why had Yash called it the Yellow Band? Must be the Sherpa nickname for it, I thought. 5 hours later, I found out I was wrong. We got to the top just as the sun was coming up, and there it was, the ridge. It looked like a gigantic dragon's tail with switchbacks and scales and complex rocky steps. I counted the so-called steps. 1, 2, 3. The yellow band was the yellow band. The first step was yet to come. Yash and Sunjo caught up to me a few minutes later. I taped them resting with their hands on their knees, then swung the camera around to the summit. Yash pointed to his watch and started toward the base of the first step. Yogi was sitting on a rock waiting for us. He checked our oxygen tanks, then made us drink something, then pointed up. The first step was about 65 feet. It was 7 a.m. and minus 35 degrees out. Zopa was right about the weather again. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, but that could change in a matter of minutes. The first 10 feet led up a crack on the left side of the cliff. Next came a traverse along an unstable ledge, making it made much harder by our weakened legs. Mine were shaking almost uncontrollably the entire traverse. The final part of the climb was a wild scramble between 2 boulders. We got to the top of the first step at 8:30 a.m. The second step was twice as steep and twice as high as the first. Before we attempted it, Yogi changed all of our oxygen tanks. Both Sunjo and I nearly passed out while we waited for him to reconnect the precious O's. There were aluminum ladders attached, to the wall of the first section. They moved and twisted under our weight and made a terrible scraping noise against the rock. Climbing the slippery rungs wasn't made any easier by wearing crampons. It was like trying to climb a ladder with ice skates. I was delighted to get off the ladder, but the final move to the top was much worse. It was a tension traverse where you could only use your arms, then swing up to the top by a bunch of old ropes tied to a sling. I wouldn't have thought it possible, but I watched Yogi do it without a hitch. Sunjo was right behind me. He looked as sick as I did about the move. I followed Yogi's route move for move, but when I grabbed the rope, my crampon slipped, and I found myself dangling by the rope like a dead fish with absolutely no momentum to get me to the top of the step. In addition to this, I had gotten twisted around with my back to the wall. I glanced over at Sanjo and Yash. They stared back at me helplessly. There was nothing they could do. I looked up. Yogi was leaning over the ledge trying to reach the sling so he could pull me up. He wasn't even close. We hadn't brought any rope with us. The extra weight would slow us down, and that could kill us. I knew the longer I hung there, the more fatigued my arms would become. If I waited too long for a solution, I wouldn't have the strength to execute it. I had to move. Now. I flipped back around, smashing my face into the wall, then drove the front spikes of my crampons into the hard rock. One of them stuck, and putting weight on that leg, I was able to relieve the pressure on my arms. Holding as tight as I could with my left hand, I let my right hand go. I pulled off the outer mitten with my teeth and let it drop, then shook the arm out. I had another pair of mittens in my pack. I repeated the procedure with my left arm. I was going to need all the strength I could in my arms for the next move, and I hoped Yogi was paying close attention above because I was going to need his help. I walked up the wall with my crampons until I was in a greater than sign position, and then I basically stood up, hoping the crampons held. Then they did. At the last second, I let go of the rope with my left hand, hoping that I could stretch it high enough for Yogi to grab. He grabbed it, but he was still going to need help getting me up. He had taken off his outer mitts too, and he had me pretty solidly. I let my right hand go and flailed away blindly for a handhold. I found a crack just big enough to dig the very tips of my sore fingers into. I pulled up with all the strength I had. If it didn't work, Yogi was going to have to let me drop. When I was as high as I thought I could go, I brought my right knee up to my chest and tried to get my foot into the sling. I barely snagged it, but it was enough. All I had to do now was stand up, and I would be within inches of the top. Yogi dragged me over the edge, and he and I lay there on our backs, gasping for breath. He reached over and cranked my take up to 4, and I did the same for him. Even with the extra oxygen, it took us a good 5 minutes to catch our breath. I wondered what was going through Sanjo's mind after he saw that. Apparently, he had learned by my mistake, because a few minutes later he swung up over the edge like a spider monkey. Yash was right behind him. They let me rest for another 15 minutes. I needed it. Yogi didn't turn my oxygen down until we were ready to leave. I needed that too. The third step was the easiest of the 3 for me, even though it came higher in the climb. Compared to what I had just been through, it was a breeze. When we got to the top, we saw another corpse. He was lying on his back with one arm splayed out and the other hand buried in the pocket of his down parka. The corpse looked pretty fresh. It might have been one of the German climbers who had died when we were at ABC. There was no sign of the other climber he had been with. I wondered if he had died on the way up to the summit or on the way down. I wondered how many people were waiting for him to come home. No one climbs a mountain thinking they're not coming back down. I looked away from the dead climber, trying to shut out Mom's warning. Beyond the corpse lay the summit pyramid's ice field, then the summit ridge. Yogi pointed at his watch, then held up 2 fingers. 2 hours left. We clipped onto ropes and started across the ice field. I don't know about Sanjo, but this is when I shifted into summit fever. At this point, I should have been completely spent, but instead, I was totally juiced. Mom's warning disappeared into thin air. Poof! Nothing was going to stop me from getting to the top. The snowfield became steeper, curving around into what I thought would be the summit, but instead we ran into fresh avalanche debris. Some of the chunks were as big as school buses. I swore. To come all this way, only to be stopped by an avalanche? It would take us hours, if not days, to scramble over the debris. Yogi pointed at the debris and shook his head. No kidding, I thought, staring at the debris bitterly. He yanked on my sleeve. I thought he was telling me that we had to go back now, that it was over. I was going to shout that we had to try for Sanjo's sake, even though I knew it was hopeless. But Yogi wasn't trying to turn me around. He was pointing at another rock cliff flanking the final buttress. The debris-filled ice field was not the route to the summit. Once again, we had to traverse a narrow ledge along the face, clipping onto a rope that looked like it had been there for 300 years. About 150 feet along the ledge, we ran into an outcropping that took a lot of finesse and time to get around. At the end of the traverse, the route stepped into a series of small ledges, which took us about 20 minutes to climb. We emerged onto the upper slope of the summit pyramid ice field, past all the avalanche debris. The wind was really blowing now. Yash led us to the shelter of an outcrop, where we rested for a few minutes before our final push. Yogi pointed out his watch again and stood. I took up the rear and recorded him, Sanjo, and Yash heading for what I thought was the summit. It wasn't. When we reached the top of the ice field, the real summit was revealed. The colorful prayer flags on the summit pole were fluttering in the wind 650 feet away. We stopped again to rest, but I cut mine short. "I'm pushing ahead," I shouted above the deafening wind. "I'll film you coming up." This wasn't exactly the truth. The real reason was that I couldn't wait to get to the top. 600 feet. 2 football fields. At nearly 29,000 feet, it felt more like 20 miles. 3 steps, rest, 3 steps, rest, 2 steps, rest. I discovered it was best to avoid looking up at the summit. Every time I peeked, it appeared farther away, as if I were walking backward. Sanjo, Yash, and Yogi were about 100 feet behind me, moving at the same snail's pace. I shot them for a couple minutes, then started out again. 100 feet, 90 feet. I stopped and checked my O's, thinking the tank must be empty. It was half full, hissing out 2 liters per minute, which didn't seem nearly enough to keep me alive. 80 feet, 50 feet. I looked at my watch. 1:09 p.m. 26 minutes to turnaround time. I stopped to rest. I was standing at 29,003 feet, higher than any other mountain on Earth. 32 feet to go. It was cold and windy, but the weather was rarely better at this altitude. I could see for hundreds of miles in every direction. Beautiful doesn't describe the view, nor does majestic. The closest word I could think of was divine, but even that fell short of what it was like. Sanjo had made up some time. He was less than 20 feet away from me. Yogi and Yash were walking on either side of him. I wanted to turn around and finish the climb, but I instead took out the camera and recorded my team coming up. I could see now that Sanjo was struggling and Yash and Yogi were actually helping him along. It was 1:19 by the time they reached me. Sanjo fell down on his knees and was having difficulty breathing. I checked his oxygen tank gauge and saw they had already cranked it up to 4 liters per minute. I gave him some time to rest, then squatted next to him. "You can do this, Sanjo. It's only about 30 feet away. Look!" I pointed to the ridgepole. He gazed up at the colorful prayer flags snapping in the wind and gave a dull nod, but he didn't move. "After you touch the pole," I said, "it's all downhill." Sanjo shook his head. "I don't think I can do it." "You have to do it. For your sisters. For yourself." He continued to shake his head. I looked at Yogi and Yash. They were in as bad a shape as Sanjo. Getting Sanjo this far had nearly done them in. I looked at my watch. 12 minutes to turnaround time. Even if we left right at that second, I wasn't sure we would make it to the summit by 1:35. "You go," Sanjo said weakly. "I'll start back down." "You can't go down the north side. The Chinese are waiting for you." "I will get around them," he said. He and I both knew this wasn't true. I looked down the mountain. 2 other climbing parties had topped the 3rd step and were winding their way up the dragon's tail. They must have gotten a late start or had run into problems along the way. If the weather held, they might be okay. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Sanjo will not reach the summit without your help. "Let's go." I pulled Sanjo to his feet. We started back up, and with each little step, Sanjo seemed to gain strength. 25 feet. 20. 17 feet. 10 feet. I stopped and stared up at the summit pole, then turned around and looked below. "What's the matter?" Sanjo asked. I looked back up at the summit pole, then pulled my goggles down and looked at Sanjo. "Do you know the date?" He shook his head. "May 30th, I said. "So?" "I think this is as far as I'm going." "What are you talking about? The summit is only a few steps away. What does the date have to do?" Tomorrow's your birthday," I said. "You have a reason to be here, Sanjo. An important reason. Your future and your sister's future. I don't have a reason for being here. I'm heading back down the north side." Sanjo stared at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was at that moment, but the decision I had made during the last few feet felt right. I didn't want to be the youngest person to summit Everest. Sanjo's father died saving my father. Reaching the top would save Sanjo and his sisters. With the money from the equipment and endorsements he would receive, they would all be able to go back to school. "It's too much," Sanjo said. "It's nothing. Come with us down the south side into Nepal." I shook my head. If I climb down the south side, everyone will know that I reached the summit. The only way down for me is the way I came up. But I do have a favor to ask. I took off my pack and found the moleskin. The yellow prayer flag with the blue mountain was hidden in a pocket in the back of the journal. I took it out and handed it to him. When you get to the top, tie this on the pole. Of course, but you need to go. Sanjo put his thick gloves together in the Buddhist way and bowed. Thank you, Peak. I will not forget this. We're running out of time. I'll tape you getting to the top so there's a record of the climb. Sanjo quickly explained what I was doing to Yogi and Yash. At first they looked shocked, then they both broke into broad smiles and clapped me on the back. Yogi is coming with you, Sanjo said. I'll be all right. He insists, Sanjo said, and so do I. Fine. We all shook hands and hugged, then I recorded Sanjo and Yash taking those last 10 steps. When they reached the summit of the highest mountain in the world, they took off their masks and smiled and waved for the camera. Sanjo tied my yellow flag to the pole, then he and Yash crossed into Nepal. Chapter 29. Down the Mountainside. I don't remember much about the trip back to Camp 6. We stumbled into camp well after dark. I vaguely remember Yogi hooking up a fresh oxygen tank to my mask, but after that, it's a blank. I didn't have any trouble sleeping, I know that. And I didn't have any regrets about not reaching the summit. I woke up with spit frozen all over my face and the worst headache of my life. The oxygen tank was empty. I grabbed another one and cranked it up to 6 for a few minutes. That got rid of most of the headache. Yogi and I were eager to get down and check on Zopa. We bypassed Camp 5 and went directly to Camp 4. As soon as we stepped into camp, we were confronted by one of the Chinese soldiers. He was dressed like a climber, except for the pistol strapped around his waist. In pretty good English, he asked me who we were and what we were doing. My name is Peak Marcello, and this is Yogi Sherpa, I said. We took supplies up to Camp 5, and we're headed back down to base camp. He called Captain Shek on the radio, and they had a long conversation in Chinese. The captain wants to talk to you, the soldier said, and handed me the radio. This is Peak Marcello, I said. Joshua Wood's son? Right. What you doing on mountain? Like I told your officer, I helped take some supplies to Camp 5. Josh is taking a climbing party up tomorrow. But you leave mountain. What are you talking about? I asked, enjoying myself immensely. I'm up at Camp 4. You have big argument with you father. Oh, that. He told me he wasn't going to let me try for the summit. It made me mad, but at least he let me get as far as Camp 5. What about other boy? What other boy? Sanjo. Oh, him, I said. He's in Nepal, which is the absolute truth. I don't believe. I have soldier bring you and Sherpa back to base camp. Whatever, I said, and handed the radio back to the soldier. They had another long conversation in Chinese, but I knew what this one was about. The other soldiers had gathered around the radio and were listening intently. The one with the radio finally signed off and shook his head with resignation. You don't have to escort us down, I said. We have orders, he said. That's fine with me, but we're going to base camp. Where else would we go? About that time, Josh came on the radio asking for me. The soldier handed me his radio again. Is everything okay, Peak? I guess. What's the matter with that captain? I don't know. Anyway, we're heading up to ABC tomorrow, so I guess we'll see you on your way to base camp. Thanks for helping Yogi get those supplies to Camp 5. I could see him and the others gathered at HQ monitoring the call from Captain Shek. No problem, I said. Is there any way you'd reconsider giving me a shot at the summit? We already talked about that, Peak. The answer is no. Maybe next year or the year after when you're a little older. You're not ready. Out. I handed the radio back, trying to look disappointed. The soldier looked at me for a moment. Do I have your word that you are going down to base camp? I held up my right hand. You have my word. All I want to do right now is crawl into my tent and go to sleep. He nodded. Yogi and I headed over to Zopa's tent, not sure what we would find. What we found was a note. Peak. I left Camp 4 yesterday. All is well. I'll see you on the road. Zopa. I was glad to hear he was okay, but the note freaked me out. It was addressed to me. The plan had been for me to top the mountain with Sanjo and cross into Nepal. How could Zopa possibly have known what I was planning to do? I didn't know what I was planning to do until I was 10 feet away from the summit. Yogi and I woke up early and left Camp 4 before anyone was awake. I wanted to give the soldiers an out so they could tell the captain that we had left before they were up. When we got to ABC, we were met by more soldiers. They were in uniform and looked uncomfortably cold. Once again, I was given a radio with a very angry Captain Shek on the other end. You leave Camp 4. Right. Without soldiers. We left before light. We didn't want to wake them. Besides, we know our way down to base camp. We don't need an escort. Soldiers at ABC escort you. Fine. The two soldiers picked for the duty were delighted to be leaving ABC. We ran into Josh and his clients just as they were arriving at Camp 2. They must have left base camp early because they had made good time. Josh took me to the side out of earshot of the Chinese soldiers. Did you make the summit? He said quietly. No. What happened? Ran out of steam, I said. No worries, he said. What about Zopa, Sunjo, and Yash? Zopa got sick and didn't get past Camp 4. I don't know where he is now. I was hoping that you'd seen him. Josh shook his head. I'm sure he's fine. He's probably slipped into the porter camp at night and is laying low. I hope so, I said. And Sunjo and Yash? He asked. As far as I know, they're in Nepal. What? I told him about Zopa's plan. He broke into a broad grin. That son of a... Captain Shek is going to flip when he finds out. Topping the mountain. He shook his head, then turned a little more serious. How far did you make it? Above Camp 6, I said. Well, you made it a lot farther than most people. I'll take you next year or the year after. We'll go up on the Nepal side. After Shek finds out about Sunjo, I'll never get a permit to climb on this side again. When did Sunjo summit? 1:32 p.m., May 30th, a day before his 15th birthday. He put his hand on my shoulder. I wish it could have been you. No worries, I said. We go, one of the soldiers said. In a minute, Josh said, then turned back to me. Shek is going to detain you when you get to base camp and ask you some questions. Thaddeus will be there with you. In real life, Thaddeus is a lawyer and fluent in Chinese law. You'll be okay. I was going to be okay, but not for the reason he thought. And I was not going to join him on another Everest climb. I'd had enough of 8,000-meter peaks, littered with corpses. I'm going home, I said. What do you mean? Back to New York. We'll talk about that when I get back down, he said. I won't be there when you get back down, I said. What's the hurry? You wouldn't understand. Try me. Okay, I want to be home for the twins' birthday. By the look on his face, I was right. He didn't understand. I haven't missed one yet, I said. Josh stared at me for a moment. Well, I guess Thaddeus can get you a ride to Kathmandu. We go now, the Chinese soldier shouted. We're just about finished, Josh said irritably. I guess I'd better go. Yeah, well, sorry it didn't work out. Josh put out his hand. Actually, it did work out, I said, shaking his hand. I'll see you around. I started following the soldiers and Yogi, then turned back and shouted, Right when you get a chance. Josh looked at me and grinned. I might just do that. We got to base camp about 5 o'clock. Captain Shek, several soldiers, and Thaddeus Bowen were waiting for me. They weren't interested in Yogi and let him go into the camp. When we got to Shek's headquarters, the first thing he did was dump everything in my pack onto a large table. Then, just like my New York detective a century ago, he examined the contents item by item. He found nothing of interest except for the digital camera Josh had gotten for me, JR's video camera, and my moleskin. He flipped through the moleskin, found mostly blank pages, and put it back down. The cameras he pushed to the side of the table. Sit, he said. There's a single straight-back chair. I sat. He asked me the same questions he had asked me up at Camp 4, but this time he had a tape recorder going and a soldier taking notes. I answered the questions in the exact same way. When he finished, he told me I could repack my things. I began stuffing things back in, but when I got to the cameras, the captain stopped me. Not those, he said. You have no right to take anything, Thaddeus said. Cameras will be returned after we look. Well, there better not be any damage to them when they are returned, Thaddeus said. Some lawyer, I thought. Glad he wasn't defending me when I was in front of that NYC judge. I'd be in jail right now. When we got outside the building, he whispered, Was there anything incriminating in those cameras? It's a little late to be asking now, I said, but the answer is no. I took the memory card out and put a blank one in. Where's the memory card? Someplace safe. It was actually stuffed in my sock. I was tired. I started toward my tent, and it wasn't until I got there I remembered I didn't have a tent there anymore. I crawled into Josh's, and I was a little surprised at how tidy everything was. All the clothes were neatly folded, gear stored in boxes. He had a little folding desk with pens, paper, and a laptop computer. Next to the computer were 2 stacks of mail. The first stack was addressed to him. The second stack was addressed to me. My stack was a lot smaller than his. I could have gotten mad again at the whole mail thing, but I didn't have the energy or interest anymore. Like I said, you don't get to pick your name or your parents. Joshua Wood is what he is. I couldn't change him or the fact that he was my father. All I could do was try not to become him. I opened the big envelope addressed to Peak P.P. Marcello. Inside was a drawing in a smaller envelope. Written on the outside of the envelope was Airplane Far, 6-year-old spelling. Inside was $67.86. Not quite enough to get to New York, but I still had Rolf's $300 in the credit card. I pulled out the drawing. It was an invitation to a birthday party. I would have to hurry if I was going to make it in time. I started toward HQ to find Thaddeus, but on the way I heard a truck start. I ran over to see if I could hitch a ride and found Yogi in the back. The drivers charged me $100, but I didn't care. I would have paid twice as much. I was on my way home, and the truck was nicer than the one we'd taken to the mountain. The covered bed was empty, with plenty of room to lie down and sleep. The two drivers took turns at the wheel and were both in a hurry. They had only stopped for fuel, which was fine with me. When we came to the road above the Friendship Bridge, where the prisoners had been shipping the boulder, the truck slowed, then came to a stop. Yogi and I hopped out of the back to find out what was going on. The boulder and prisoners were gone. In their place was a Buddhist monk with a shaved head and an orange robe. He was talking to the driver with his back to us. As we walked up, he turned around and smiled. It was Zopa! He looked fully recovered, as healthy as he had been the first day I met him in the Indrayani temple. How did you get here? He held up his thumb. I hitchhiked. Somehow I doubted that. Why would someone drop him off on this lonely stretch of road? The only thing nearby was the border crossing at the Friendship Bridge. Unless he had asked to be let out here. I will see you on the road, his note had said. I figured he had messed up the phrase and meant down the road. I guess I was wrong. The three of us got into the back of the truck. I thought we were in for a big hassle at the bridge, but when we got there, the guards looked in our truck, glanced at our papers, then waved us through without a word. We made one more stop before we got to the airport in Kathmandu. I complained that I needed to get to the airport, but Zopa made a good point. They will not allow you on an airplane looking and smelling like you do. The monks at the monastery washed my clothes as I took a long bath. Zopa rode to the airport with me. Before going into the terminal, I pulled out the note Zopa had left for us at Camp 4. How did you know you'd see me on that road? Zopa shrugged. The answer didn't surprise me. I unzipped a side pocket on my pack and pulled out the memory card. You might need this to prove Sanjo got to the summit. Zopa took the card and stashed it in the folds of his orange robe. Will we see you again on Sagarmatha? I wanted to shrug my reply, but I couldn't because I knew the answer. No, I said, but I might return to Kathmandu to visit. You are welcome any time. Zopa bowed and gave me a blessing. When he looked up, he said, Thank you for what you did for my grandson. I returned the bow. Thank you for what your son did for my father. Chapter 30. Denouement. It took 24 hours to get to New York, but because I crossed the international date line going west, I got there only a few hours after I left Kathmandu. I grabbed a cab and nervously fidgeted as the driver fought the heavy traffic into the city, hoping that I wouldn't be too late. When he pulled up in front of our building, I gave him a fistful of cash without even counting it. I took the elevator to the loft. I heard the party before I saw it. Rolf knew how to throw a party. Mom and I were a little weak in that area. There would be no less than 75 people in the loft. Parents and their kids, teachers from GSS, neighbors, people from Mom's bookstore, lawyers from Rolf's office. Last year, for entertainment, Rolf had hired a group of performing dogs. The year before that, he had brought a reptile woman, Helen the herpetologist, the twins' favorite, with bags of snakes, turtles, and lizards. It turned out that I was the entertainment this year. At least that's what it looked like when I walked through the front door. I told you he would be here. I did too. The two P's dropped their presents and threw their little arms around my thighs. Mom was next, then Rolf. I told myself I wasn't going to cry, but that idea went right out the window as soon as I saw them. As we hugged, everyone sang happy birthday. When everything had settled down a little, Mom pulled me into the kitchen and asked me how I was. I told her I was tired and a little sore. You've lost weight, she said. I guess. She looked at me for a moment, then gave me another hug. I'm glad you're back. Me too. So, you didn't make it to the summit. How'd you know that? Josh called this morning, said to tell you happy birthday. This was a first. Where was he? He didn't say, somewhere up the mountain. The connection wasn't very good. It reminded me of the old days. I bet, I said. I know I should have called, but I wanted it to be a surprise." "It was still a surprise," Mom said. "I didn't think you'd get here in time for the birthday, although the 2Ps insisted I was wrong." "Is everything okay here? I mean, is it all right that I came back?" "Your skyscraper stunt is old news, and Rolf and I are trying to keep it that way," she said. "What do you mean, trying?" "Holly Angelo." "Uh-oh," I said. "She's been hanging around a lot." "I'm sorry." "No, it's okay. I kinda like her, and the twins are wild about her. Rolf, well, he tolerates her. We've talked her into not writing about your Everest trip. It would just bring up the whole skyscraper thing again, and we don't want to do that, especially now that you're back in town. It's best if we..." Rolf opened the kitchen door with an apologetic, worried look on his face. "Peek!" Holly pushed him aside as she assaulted the kitchen wearing a bright pink pantsuit, lime green scarf, and a red purse the size of a suitcase. I let her throw her spidery arms around me and actually hugged her back. It was good to see her. When she finally set me free, she glanced furtively around the kitchen as if she were looking for spies. "I heard you didn't make it to the summit," she whispered. "I'm sorry." "How did you find out?" "I've talked to Josh several times in the past couple of days." "He was being pretty chatty, it seemed." Holly put a red purse on the counter, then looked around again and pulled out a newspaper. "This is about to hit the streets." "Youngest Person Summits Everest" by Holly Angelo. It was a full-page spread with several photos taken from the video I had shot. The biggest photo was of Sunjo, Yogi, and Yash sitting next to the summit pole. "I think there's a book in this," Holly said. "I talked to Sunjo today. He said to say hello and to wish you a happy birthday. He also told me he's enjoying the birthday present you gave him, and so are his sisters." I smiled. "What did you get him?" Holly asked. "Nothing much," I said. "I better go out and mingle." Rolf gave me a doubtful look. I said hello to a few people, got a tour of the twins' presents, then noticed Vincent sitting in the corner by himself, gathering grist. I was surprised to see him. We always invited him to the parties, but he rarely showed up. "Thanks for coming," I said. "I was just about ready to leave when you walked through the door," Vincent said. "You've had an interesting few weeks." "You read The Moleskin," I said. "Yes, and it was well written. Unfortunately, there's only a beginning and a partial middle to the story. Even though you managed to fill the moleskin, I'm afraid the assignment is incomplete. The story lacks a climax, an end, and a denouement, so I cannot..." "There's a second moleskin," I said. "I'm not sure about the climax, but the story does have an end, kind of, and I'm right in the middle of the denouement, literally." I pointed at the partygoers. Vincent smiled. "Of course, I see your point. How about if I finish it up tomorrow morning?" "That'll be fine," he said. "I'll be at GSS until noon. School is out for the summer and the deadline for your assignment has passed, but under the circumstances, I think we can make an exception." He stood up. "And again, it is a well-crafted story. You left me hanging. I'm desperate to find out what happened." I'm sitting in my bedroom finishing the moleskin. The twins are awake. I hear them giggling and arguing as they eat their mid-morning snack. I promise to take them to GSS with me when I drop off the moleskin. Here they come, their little feet pattering up the steps. The door opens. "What are you doing?" "You said you'd take us to school." "I'm working on my assignment," I said. "What's this?" Patricia points at the newspaper article about Sunjo pinned on my bulletin board. "Is that you?" Paul asked, pointing at Sunjo. "No." "What are those flags?" "Prayer flags." "What's a prayer flag?" "There's a prayer written on the flag. When it blows in the wind, the prayer goes up to God. If you put the flag really high on a mountain, the prayer gets to God faster." "Looks like that yellow one has a blue mountain on it like the ones you used to draw." "It could be. Now sit on my bed and be quiet so I can finish this." "We missed you, Peek." "We love you, Peek." "I love you too. I'm almost finished." I look at the twins, smiling, and write my last sentence. "The only thing you'll find on the summit of Mount Everest is a divine view. The things that really matter lie far below." So that's the end of Peak by Roland Smith. Thank you so much for joining me and sticking with me as I read this to you, and I really hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did.